For our last card, we're going to do this roses stained glass card. So you're actually going to need 2 of your image die cuts for this one. We'll use the second one later. But with the first one, we are going to glue it down to a piece of Yupo. So Yupo is a synthetic paper. It's a plastic paper, and it's great for working with alcohol inks on, which is what we're going to use to color in the image for this. So I'm putting my glue around the outside, and then I'm going to put a layer of it around each one of the roses and on the backs of the leaves. You don't necessarily need to have it on the back of every single thing, but I do tend to put it around the main parts. We're going to put it down onto our Yupo here. Now my piece of Yupo is bigger than it needs to be. So we're just going to use a scissors to trim it while the glue is drying. You could also do this on like a transparency and have it be see-through. The only thing then is you would want to cut a window in your card base so that you could see right through the front of your card. And I chose not to do that for this one simply because it's just a slightly easier version of this technique, but it would also be pretty that way. There we go. So typically I would wait for the glue to dry totally, but we're going to carry on. So I've got some alcohol inks here. I've got them in a little paint tray, and I'm using these little brushes to paint the alcohol ink on. Now these brushes are disposable eyeliner brushes. You could do this with a paintbrush, but the one thing with a paintbrush is you want to clean it between colors. And you would just clean it with some isopropyl alcohol. But for these, I just keep them. I can tell what color, or that it's a light blue or whatever on there, so I can reuse them over and over again. So they're not being used once and then disposed of. So I do one layer of color over that back, or over the whole area. And then you can see I go back and I kind of just pounce up and down. You know how stained glass has just that interesting texture to it? That's what I'm trying to create here. If you wanted it to be completely smooth, you would just do the one layer and then let it completely dry. But I'm trying to get that texture that stained glass has. So you can tell from this, I've got some dotting and just some different texture in the background there. That's what I'm trying to create. And just like the glitter technique, this one also needs to have a black outline because alcohol ink would color any other color here. Now, having said that, we're going to alter the black outline for the front to create the stained glass, kind of the leading look. And when you go put some alcohol ink in a tray, don't put a ton of it in there. A little goes a long way, and it also starts to evaporate and dissipate while you're using it. So you don't want something that's going to completely evaporate before you get to use it all. So just put a couple drops in there. You may need to add a drop or two as you're working, but better to do that than to waste a bunch. And then once this is completely dry too, I go back and just pounce up and down again. The texture is just a tiny little bit different once the alcohol ink layer below it dries. So you can add as much or as little texture to it as you want. I like to have a variety of the texture in there. I need a little bit more. And obviously you can use any color for this. I'm just keeping the colors for all the cards very similar. And then same with die cuts. It doesn't necessarily need to be this die cut. You would just want something that has some openings to it that you want to create this look with. And you can see I'm not being super, super careful with this brush either. Because it's a disposable one, you don't need to be super careful with it. But I do go back and just add some more of that texture until you get a look that you like. Any of the areas that you already like it, you don't need to go back to those ones. There we go. So I'm going to leave that with the background, and now let's do the flower. So I've got a coral color here. I'm using a little pink tray that has some dips in it. You could also just use a piece of recycled plastic, that would work as well. So same as the background, I do one layer solid, and then I go back and just do the pounce texture. And as my ink dries up in the plate there, it does tend to get a tiny little bit darker. So as it gets like that, I tend to go back and just try to do kind of the bottom of the flower petals, just to get a little bit more lights and darks in them. It's not going to be a huge difference. But I do kind of like to see a little bit of the darker color there. And same as the background, just add a few extra drops as your alcohol ink in your palette there dries. And you'll notice when you get a large amount of alcohol ink on your brush and then pounce it up and down, your texture is a lot bigger than if your brush is a little bit dry. So play around with it, find which texture you like to use, and just have fun with it. I like these little brushes just because they're tiny. So you have a little bit more control over how much texture there is. If you have a brush that's too big, the texture, it tends to be a little bit on the bigger side, and you have a little bit less control over trying to get small dots there. You could also do this with the alcohol ink markers, the Copic markers that were used for the last technique. The only thing is you wouldn't be able to get this extra texture from when I'm bouncing or pouncing the brush on there. It would look a little bit different. But coloring the background, coloring the Yupo would also work with the Copic markers. All right, I'm going to let that completely dry, but we have that totally covered or colored.